speak about Uzbekistan again. This isn't really a central concern of my research, but I went last April and did an assessment for USAID looking at the prospects for reform, and I've been following it ever since. And so I've been asked several times to try to discuss it and make sense of it for people in Washington. And I think that in general, the discussions in Washington about this kind of center on, is this reform real or not? And I think that depends on what you think reform is. There's reasons to be optimistic about change in Uzbekistan. The first reason, I think, is that the impetus is coming from the country itself. There's no doubt that Uzbekistan is not trying to impress the West. I think the West isn't really watching that much. I don't think, certainly the United States is not really out there pushing for reform in Central Asia right now. So it's interesting to see that this really is coming from Mirziyoyev's administration itself. And I think in and of itself, that is good news. That suggests that there has to be something serious about this. It is opening up to its neighbors regionally and to a certain degree to the world. I think that's very good news for the region in general. If you think back to the 1990s, Uzbekistan had a lot of promise, and Uzbekistan really emerged as the most important country regionally. And with Uzbekistan opening up, that may begin to change. It might make things more interesting regionally. It might also help carry the weight for the region a little bit more, having two large states kind of carrying weight for the region. The currency does seem to be in the process of convertibility. I don't pretend to be an expert on currency conversion, but they have devalued the currency significantly. They're working closely with the IMF and the World Bank in terms of trying to gradually lose complete state control over currency. And this, of course, is the key issue if they want to get foreign investment. And it seems that they're taking it very seriously. And more recently, we saw the dismissal of Inayatov, who was the head of the security forces, and that came as a real surprise. I think a lot of the people, including myself, who were skeptical of some of the changes, saw that Inayatov could be a serious barrier to changes. And we've seen both his removal, but we've also seen a lot of other stories about various people within his apparatus being purged, being arrested on corruption charges, and so on. And I would say that at this point, things have progressed to the point where it's difficult to totally go back on these promises of reforms. I mean, one of the criticisms of reforms in Uzbekistan has been that, well, when Niyazov died in Turkmenistan, Berdimuhamedov was saying all these things about maybe we can reform, maybe we can change. That didn't last too long. It never happened. I think the situation in Uzbekistan is already beyond that. It's no longer in the realm of just talk. There's things happening. It's a much bigger state. There's people excited. I think it would be very difficult to really reel this back in and just kind of go back to the Karimov state of things. So that's the good news. But at the same time, there's reasons to be pessimistic about change in Uzbekistan. We saw recently last week, Mirziyoyev gave a special advisory role in the Interior Ministry to Zakir Almatov, who was seen as one of the people responsible for the Andijan massacre. So it looks like he might be, in fact, creating his own security apparatus. He's not just disempowering the security apparatus. We don't know what to think about this yet. It's quite early to see how that's going to evolve, but it's a somewhat ominous sign. There's no significant signs of structural change in terms of democratization yet. There's lots of talk about it. We see some loosening of the reins of state media. We see some releases of political prisoners, but we see others not being released. We see some interaction with human rights groups, but we don't see a revival of civil society in the country. So there's no real structural changes yet happening in this area. And there remain many entrenched interests in the country, which will likely slow progress in reforms. And I think it's important to remember that Inuyatov is not the only entrenched interest from Karimov's regime. It goes much lower, I think, into society. And finally, some of my colleagues at Radio Free Asia, or Radio Free Europe, have frequently pointed out that Russia is becoming more influential in Uzbekistan. In particular, the relationship between Mirziyoyev and Alisher Usmanov, which is apparently a blood relation, or at least by marriage. So that may be an ominous sign, but on the other hand, I don't know for sure, and I don't know what to really think about that yet, because Usmanov himself is Uzbek, and he may have some interest in the future of Uzbekistan as well. So I'm going to put out there the idea that what Mirziyoyev wants to do is make Uzbekistan the next Kazakhstan. I think when he looks, all of his reforms have been really focused on bringing in foreign investment, getting the economy going. He's seen what happened in Kazakhstan over the last 25 years, and he wants to see that happen to Uzbekistan. And he understands that, in the early 90s, all of the international organizations wanted to first set up their offices in Tashkent, and they quickly moved to Almaty because it was very apparent that nothing was really happening in Uzbekistan and things were happening in Kazakhstan. And as a result, Kazakhstan has benefited. But what does that mean to be more like Kazakhstan? It means liberalizing the economy and kickstarting a more vibrant private sector. And I think that's something that we're seeing happening. We have a gradual implementation of floating the currency on international markets. There's a lot of initiatives to promote entrepreneurship in the country. But I think first and foremost, there's an understanding that they have to bring in money. So it means attracting foreign investment. And I found this statistic the other day that in the 25 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan attracted $152 billion in foreign investment. Uzbekistan attracted $9.6 billion. So that tells you a lot about where they are vis-a-vis Kazakhstan now and maybe where they want to be. Opening up foreign trade, and they are starting to try to do that. Of course, the currency convertibility is a critical part of that. And opening up the political space enough to encourage economic participation and innovation, but not enough to challenge the regime. I mean, that's kind of the model that Kazakhstan has created. And I think that's the key question that we want to look at further, because that's the difficult part. So how do you create managed political reform? You need to create a rule of law infrastructure that at least is strong enough to encourage foreign investment and make foreign investors comfortable with coming into the country with their money. That they're going to make investments that are not just going to disappear into thin air. You need enough access to information to ensure that the local economic actors can take informed actions domestically and internationally. So you need access to information about what's happening in Uzbekistan and what's happening in the world. And you need to encourage enough freedom in civil society to encourage risk-taking, experimentation, and innovation. That part I don't think is really, I think both with the information and civil society, we don't see that happening yet in Uzbekistan. And all this has to happen while not threatening the regime. And I think Uzbekistan faces a couple difficulties in trying to create that kind of managed political reform. First, there's a lack of democratic political culture in the country. There seems to be attempts to reform the justice system, but one thing I've learned about rule of law reform over the years is that it's not a technical issue. It's not about institutions only. It's about a culture where people, there's a compact between the citizens and the justice system of trust, where people believe in the justice system, where the justice system actually responds to people. And that's a much trickier thing to create. I don't think, for example, any of the development agencies I've ever worked with really knows how to do that. Uzbekistan's political space in general was never at the state of Kazakhstan's. But even in the 1990s, you know, it wasn't to the extent you saw in Kazakhstan. But after 2005, it really just kind of disappeared. When you had some independent media, some independent civil society actors in the 90s, after 2005, they pretty much just disappeared. So you'd have to actually create a new sense of civil society in Uzbekistan and a new notion of independent media, and you'd have to do that from scratch because the people who worked on that in the 90s are not really around anymore. And we're not even yet talking about political parties or free elections. That has never happened in Uzbekistan. And you know, in Kazakhstan, we do not have free and fair elections. But in Kazakhstan, there are political parties, there are opposition political parties, they are controlled opposition parties. But that's a difficult thing to create, and I don't think Uzbekistan is anywhere close to even thinking about how to do that. The other issue I think that Uzbekistan faces is the entrenched interests, as I mentioned before. And this isn't just the security organs. It goes down to, well, I mean, first of all, on the economic side, I think one thing that has to be discussed is the influence of state-owned enterprises, which when I was there last year, I learned were much more extensive in their control than I even had an understanding of previously, because businesses like Uzbek Airways actually control all kinds of sectors beyond aviation. So they're like huge corporations. And it's hard to believe that they're going to be open to privatization without a fight. And that's, I think, a major issue in the economic side. When we talk about the political side, even the notion of cultivating independent civil society is going to be difficult, because after 2005, the government created an entire infrastructure of government-organized NGOs, or gongos, that have a vested interest in keeping the status quo, because all of the grants flow through them, whether it's international or domestic. And those people, I can't see them wanting to give up that situation easily. And similarly, I think with the media, you have an entire infrastructure of state-owned media, and then you also have this gongo called the National Association of Electronic Media, or NAISME, which controls all of the media activity in the country and all of the assistance to media. And I can't see them giving up that hold. So I think these barriers bring up a lot of questions about how things will go forward in Uzbekistan, because I don't see the ability to just do the economic reforms without bringing in some freedom in the political space. And that's going to be much more difficult, I think, than anybody might think. And I just wanted to end my talk with some policy recommendations for the U.S. government, because I know there's often people here from the U.S. government. And so, first of all, I think it's a no-brainer that the U.S. should encourage and assist where appropriate in promoting the country's economic reforms. This is, if Uzbekistan is able to convert their currency and attract foreign investment, I think it'll be good for the region. I think it'll be good for the world, and it will certainly be good for Uzbek citizens. So I think that's kind of a no-brainer. But beyond that, I think with the justice system, this is an important area where the U.S. should engage with Uzbekistan, because Mirziyoyev is taking very serious the idea of judicial reform. But as I mentioned before, that is not an easy thing to do. And frankly, it's unclear whether the structural reforms he's laid out will really be able to create a rule of law. So I think it's important in terms of engaging Uzbekistan on judicial reform and reform of the justice system in general, that we have to make it known that this is something that needs a change in culture in addition to structural changes and institutional changes. Obviously, it's important to continue, and I feel like I have to say this because right now the U.S. government's not really promoting human rights, but I feel like we have to say it's important to impress upon Uzbekistan that human rights issues matter. And not only just because that's the right thing to do, but actually that will influence whether they get foreign direct investment, because the issues of political prisoners and the issues of child labor and cotton picking are going to be things that's going to make large international corporations reticent to invest in the country. And then finally, I think it's important that the U.S. does encourage political liberalization without pushing too hard for immediate democratization, because I think that's unrealistic and would only have the opposite effect. And one thing I should mention about this is that one thing that has to happen if Uzbekistan is going to attract either U.S. or European assistance in this area is that the country needs to get rid of its restrictions on foreign assistance, which make it very difficult right now for anybody to start a development program that's going to even assist in any way with political liberalization. It has to be able, right now, if you want to give money to a local NGO, you have to go through all these hoops with the Ministry of Justice, which make it almost impossible to do anything. So really, that's the first thing that has to be done. But besides that, I do think they have to think about breaking this gongo system or mafia in the country. It's interesting because these gongos are actually very involved in the reform process. And they're not necessarily, they're not evil. They just have a monopoly on the idea of civil society in the country. And they actually would be great think tanks, state-sponsored think tanks. So maybe they need to be transformed into state-supported think tanks. But they have to be taken out of the realm of civil society. And there should be an opening up to the idea of organizations, civic organizations being able to register in the country and to operate with less stringent restrictions. Similarly, they need to open up licensing for independent media outlets, TV, newspapers, radio. I think it's impossible to open up the information field entirely through the state media. I think that they're going to have to, at some point, be ready to open up the media to non-governmental actors. And they have to open up the internet. the internet in the world today, you can't really attract foreign investment and become a player in the global economy without opening up the internet. And right now, it's still very closed in Uzbekistan. When I was there last year, they couldn't access video conferencing on Skype. You couldn't access a whole variety of web pages. You couldn't use WhatsApp. So there's things that you have to begin to do if they want to open up in terms of the political space. And finally, encouraging public political debate and gradually maybe considering the registration of new political parties, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that ever happening soon. So anyways, that's what I wanted to say, kind of introduce some ideas about what's happening in Uzbekistan, and demonstrate that while things are generally positive, it's still a long road for them to even aspire to be as liberal as Kazakhstan. Thank you.
So